Imagine this, the most powerful man in the world, the ruler of 50 million souls, commander of the greatest army on earth, a self-declared god gasping for air, naked and delirious as a wrestler's hands tighten around his throat. The marble walls of his palace echo with silence. No senators to plead for him, no priests to beg the heavens, just water steam and the slow suffocation of a man who believed he was immortal. This is not a myth. This is history. And his name was Commodus. You may know him as the villain from Gladiator, a jealous emperor who sends slaves to die for sport. But the truth is darker, stranger, and far more disturbing. Commodus wasn't just corrupt. He was convinced he was a living god born not to rule Rome, but to become Rome. In his eyes, he wasn't merely Caesar. He was Hercules reborn, Jupiter made flesh, a divine executioner sent to purify the world with blood and spectacle. And Rome believed him, or at least pretended to. For 12 years, the Roman Empire lived under the shadow of one man's madness. Senators were butchered. Gladiators were forced to kneel before him. The calendar was renamed in his honor. And the city of Rome itself, 2,000 years of tradition, was rebranded Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. This is not the story of a tyrant who grew drunk with power. This is the story of a man who was raised to believe that power itself made him divine. From his earliest days, he was treated not as a child, but as a future god-emperor. And when he finally took the throne, he made sure the world bent to his vision, even if it meant setting fire to everything his father had built. But like all stories of divine hubris, this one ends in tragedy. Not on a battlefield, not in a Senate chamber, but in a bathtub, alone, choking on the realization that gods don't bleed until they do. So how does a golden boy, son of a philosopher-king, become a blood-soaked spectacle in his own arena? How does the mind of an emperor fracture so completely that he turns the greatest civilization on earth into a personal stage for madness? That's what we're about to uncover. Strap in. Because the story of Commodus isn't just about Rome. It's about what happens when absolute power isn't just abused, it's worshipped. He was born into greatness. Commodus, son of Marcus Aurelius, heir to a dynasty forged in blood, philosophy, and discipline. His birth in 161 AD wasn't just celebrated, it was prophesied. The empire whispered that a golden age would continue unbroken through the veins of the philosopher-king's own flesh and blood. But here's the truth. History rarely tells the boy was a flaw in the plan from the start. Marcus Aurelius was not your typical Roman emperor. He didn't throw lavish parties or parade about the arena. He studied Stoic philosophy, kept a worn-out journal full of personal reflections, and governed with a heavy, burdened conscience. His ideal ruler was calm, rational, detached from ego. And in many ways, he embodied it. But Marcus made one mistake, a mistake that would undo everything he built. He broke with tradition. For generations, Roman emperors had adopted their heirs, choosing the wisest and most capable from across the elite class. Marcus Aurelius rejected this. He chose blood over merit. He chose Commodus. And Commodus was no Stoic. As a child, he was surrounded not by scholars, but by servants who feared him. He was crowned Caesar at the age of 5. He attended gladiator games not as a spectator, but as a boy fascinated with the blood. His tutors struggled to instill discipline. He showed flashes of cruelty, flashes of theatrical self-importance, and an unsettling joy in watching men suffer. While his father led campaigns against the Germanic tribes along the Danube, Commodus rode beside him, not to learn warcraft, but to be seen, admired, flattered. Soldiers whispered that the boy seemed more intrigued by the uniforms than the strategy, more in love with the power than the purpose. Historians today still debate, was Commodus born twisted, or was he twisted by power? Was he the product of inherited weakness, or of an empire that had forgotten how to say no to its emperors? Whatever the cause, by the time Marcus Aurelius died in 180 AD, the fate of the empire was sealed. Commodus didn't just inherit a throne. He inherited the legacy of the 5 good emperors, a legacy of stability, strength, and moral restraint. And in less than a year, he would start dismantling all of it piece by piece. Because Commodus wasn't interested in ruling Rome. He wanted to become something Rome had never seen before, a god adored in flesh, praised in blood. At first, Rome was hopeful. The legions had already proclaimed Commodus co-emperor during his father's final campaigns. The Senate endorsed him. The people weary from war welcomed a peaceful transition, a young, handsome ruler with divine lineage. What could go wrong? Everything. One of Commodus's first acts as sole emperor wasn't to complete his father's northern conquests or strengthen the empire's fragile borders. Instead, he negotiated a rushed peace and returned to Rome draped in laurel and gold, as if he had triumphed in battle. He hadn't. But that didn't matter. To Commodus, appearances were reality. Symbols were substance. He hadn't won a war, but he had won the spotlight. And that's all he ever wanted. What followed was a slow, theatrical unraveling of imperial sanity. Commodus didn't just centralize power, he sanctified it. He began insisting on divine titles, referring to himself not only as Augustus, but as Invictus, the Unconquered. Later, he would adopt the full title Lucius, Aelius, Aurelius, Commodus, Augustus, Hercules, Romanus, Exuperatorius, Amazonius, Invictus, Felix Pius. That wasn't a joke. That was official imperial protocol. He was no longer just emperor. He was Rome personified. Temples were rededicated in his honor. Statues depicted him not in the toga of a Roman statesman, but clad in lion skins wielding a club like Hercules. He posed for coinage as a demigod. Public festivals were renamed. Even the calendar bent to his will. September became Commodus, October Invictus, December Amazonius, Rome. The Eternal City was no longer called Rome. Commodus renamed it Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. It was no longer the capital of an empire. It was the personal kingdom of a god. But it didn't stop there. He demanded worship. Senators were ordered to kneel. Guards and courtiers were trained to treat him as divine, not in the poetic, exaggerated sense Roman emperors had sometimes allowed, but literally. They prostrated themselves in his presence. They were forbidden from speaking unless spoken to. Anyone who hesitated, anyone who failed to show proper reverence, was labeled a traitor. Execution became entertainment. Reverence became survival. This wasn't traditional Roman deification which came after death. This was something else entirely. Commodus wasn't waiting for apotheosis. He believed he was already divine. And when a man believes he is a god, rules no longer apply. His power was no longer political. It was religious. To defy him was blasphemy. To question him was treason. The lines between state and spectacle politics and performance began to blur. Rome had always worshipped its emperors, but now it was being forced to worship a man who demanded applause for existing. And the empire for a while played along, because everyone knew what happened to those who didn't. In the ancient world, the Roman Colosseum was sacred. It was where emperors displayed their clemency, not their egos. Where justice was dispensed through spectacle, yes, but spectacle with rules, with hierarchy, with meaning. Then Commodus stepped into the sand and everything changed. No longer content with watching from the imperial box, Commodus descended into the arena not as patron, but as participant. Sword in hand, muscles oiled, lion skin draped over his shoulders, he declared himself Hercules reborn. And the gods he claimed had sent him to cleanse the world through blood. But there was no real combat. His opponents were old, wounded, or drugged. Some were even amputees. Others were armed with wooden swords. Commodus, meanwhile, used sharpened steel. He performed executions more than he fought duels. He didn't risk death. He orchestrated theater. Sometimes he faced exotic beasts, lions, ostriches, elephants, most of which had been starved or tranquilized. At one point, he shot hundreds of wild animals with arrows from a raised platform claiming godlike precision. The crowd was forced to cheer, but the applause rang hollow, because deep down everyone knew what they were watching. A man playing God terrified of being seen as weak. And he did this not once or twice, but hundreds of times. He billed himself as the Roman Hercules, scrawling his name on statues of actual gods, rewriting stories to include himself as the hero. He ordered new murals showing him wrestling lions and slaying giants. He even rewrote myths, turning his private victories into divine epics. It was more than delusion. It was addiction. He needed the arena. He needed the eyes, the gasps, the manufactured awe. It wasn't enough to rule Rome, he had to be worshipped for. It celebrated like a gladiator who fought and bled for his people. Except Commodus didn't bleed. Others did. And those who watched senators, generals, merchants were not entertained. They were horrified. But they clapped. Because fear kept them clapping. This obsession with the arena warped more than just his image. It warped the Roman economy. Commodus demanded new games, constantly bleeding the treasury dry to import wild animals from across the empire, tigers from India, hippos from Egypt, bears from Germania. Ships full of beasts docked daily while taxpayers footed the bill. Advisors warned him, economists begged him, senators pleaded. He ignored them all. Or worse, he punished them for speaking. Some were executed, others exiled. Many simply disappeared. Anyone who suggested that the empire had bigger problems than stagecraft became tomorrow's entertainment. Because in Commodus's Rome, if you weren't cheering, you were bleeding. The line between performer and ruler was gone. He had turned governance into theater, the Colosseum into a palace, and power into parody. And the people those he claimed to fight for were exhausted, afraid, and dangerously close to revolt. Rome didn't need a god. It needed a leader. But Commodus had stopped being that long ago. As Commodus's obsession with divine spectacle deepened, so too did his fear. He saw betrayal in every silence, treason in every glance. The same senators who once bowed in reverence now terrified him. The same generals who had once secured Rome's borders were now whispered threats in his mind. Even his household slaves, the ones who dressed him in his lion skins and oiled his shoulders before arena appearances, he suspected them too. And so he began to cleanse, not the empire, but his court. His advisors, his friends, his family. He created a culture where survival depended not on merit, loyalty, or service, but on the ability to perform submission. The more dramatically you flattered him, the safer you were. For now. But the goalposts shifted daily. A missed bow, a pause before applause, an awkward sentence, any of these could send you to the arena floor. Informants swarmed every level of society. Slaves reported on masters. Wives betrayed husbands. Soldiers turned on their officers. A servant who overheard a senator sigh too deeply during a festival could earn favor by turning him in. It was no longer about truth, it was about appearances. And the appearance Commodus craved was total control. He stopped attending Senate meetings, preferring to summon senators one by one like actors in a casting call. He would scan their faces, watching their expressions for flickers of doubt. A nervous laugh. A diverted gaze that could mean exile or execution. Entire families vanished overnight. Estates were seized. Their names scratched from records as if they had never existed. Even long-serving military leaders, heroes of the frontier, found themselves stripped of rank or worse. Not because they failed in war, but because they failed to smile at the wrong time. And all the while, Commodus continued his performances. He fought. He posed. He preened. He rewrote festivals to include chants in his name. He had new temples built not to honor Jupiter or Mars, but himself. Governors in the provinces were forced to erect statues and fund public rituals that declared Commodus the savior of mankind. Those who hesitated, replaced, or executed. Rome had known tyrants before. It had survived Caligula, Nero, even Domitian. But Commodus was something different. His madness wasn't wild and unchecked, it was structured. It had stages, scripts, choreography. He built a world where everyone was forced to play a role in his theater of sanity, and the moment they broke character, they were eliminated. Some tried to resist quietly. A few senators exchanged nervous letters. Others plotted escape. But the walls were closing. Commodus didn't just own Rome's armies, he owned its atmosphere. The empire was suffocating not under swords, but under paranoia. Because in a world ruled by a man who thinks he's a god, there is no truth, only loyalty. And even that is temporary. Everyone in Commodus's orbit eventually faced the same question, not if you'll fall from grace, but when. By the end of 192 AD, even the inner circle of Commodus had reached a terrifying conclusion. The empire was no longer ruled. It was held hostage by a madman in a lion skin. And there was no fixing him, not with counsel, not with reason. not even with fear. The man who once strutted through the marble halls of the Palatine Palace now lived in a fantasy of blood and applause. He had moved his residence closer to the gladiator barracks. He was planning to begin the new year not as emperor in a purple toga, but as a gladiator in full armor marching into the Senate chamber to rule from the arena floor. That wasn't just humiliation. It was the end of Rome as anyone knew it. So 3 people, each of them once loyal, each of them close, made a decision. They would kill a god. The plotters were not revolutionaries. They weren't dreamers hoping to restore the Republic. They were survivors. Letus, the Praetorian prefect commander of the emperor's personal guard, had been loyal for years, but Commodus had begun to eye him with suspicion. A death sentence hung invisible in the air. Letus knew it was only a matter of time. Eclectus, the imperial chamberlain, managed access to the emperor. He had watched Commodus deteriorate day after day, ritual after ritual. He had seen friends vanish into silence. He had memorized every corridor where screams were muffled and never returned. And finally, Marcia, the emperor's favorite concubine, the only person who could speak to him without ceremony. She had once calmed his rages, whispered reason into his ear. But Commodus had written her name on a death list. She knew. They tried poison first. Marcia served him wine laced with a slow-acting toxin. The emperor drank. He laughed. He began to sweat. He groaned. But Commodus didn't die. Instead, he vomited violently, uncontrollably. The poison came up. The emperor staggered toward the baths to ease his stomach, groggy but alive. The conspirators panicked. The clock was ticking. They summoned Narcissus, a professional wrestler and gladiator trainer, quiet, loyal, brutal. He slipped through the palace under false orders. By the time Commodus sank into his private bath, steam rising, heartbeat slowing, Narcissus was waiting. There was no speech, no warning. He grabbed Commodus by the throat, forced his head beneath the water, and held him there. The struggle was short, wet, silent. Thus ended the reign of the god emperor, not in fire or war or glory, but in a bath strangled by calloused hands while no one came to save him. Because by then, no one wanted to. The death of Commodus was supposed to be the end of the madness. But Rome by then was already cracked beneath the marble. When word of his death spread, there were no riots, no national mourning. The Senate didn't hesitate. They convened at dawn, declared Commodus, a public enemy, and ordered his statues pulled down and destroyed. The months he had renamed were restored. Colonia Commodiana went back to being Rome. For a moment it looked like healing had begun, but the wound went deeper than anyone expected. Commodus had hollowed out the empire's core. He had decimated the Senate's independence, turned the military into his personal stage crew, and bled the treasury dry. Rome was left with a government of sycophants, a nervous military leadership, and a population that had been forced to cheer while the empire burned. The man chosen to restore order, Pertinax, an old senator of impeccable character, lasted only 87 days. Why? Because the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own bodyguards, had grown used to Commodus's chaos. They liked being kingmakers. When Pertinax refused to play the game, refused to bribe them, flatter them, or indulge them, they killed him. In broad daylight. And then they did the unthinkable. They auctioned off the empire to the highest bidder. What followed was one of the bloodiest chapters in Roman history, the year of the 5 emperors. Civil war, assassinations, armies marching on Rome to claim the throne like prize fighters entering the arena. The very thing Commodus had turned government into a violent game had become reality. Eventually, Septimius Severus rose to power, crushing his rivals and restoring order. But the damage had been done. The lesson was clear: the throne no longer belonged to virtue or philosophy or tradition. It belonged to whoever had the swords and gold to take it. And that was Commodus's true legacy. Not the statues, not the costumes, not the blood in the arena, but the normalization of spectacle over substance, of loyalty through fear, of governance as performance. Commodus didn't just act like a god, he infected the empire with his delusions. He made Rome a stage, and when the curtains fell, there was no script left for recovery. Historians would later debate his sanity. Some claimed madness. Others saw only vanity gone unchecked. But in the end, the question doesn't matter, because the consequences were real. The empire that had once prided itself on order law and stoic discipline had bowed to a man who killed wounded slaves in costume and called it divine justice. And when he died, the world didn't rejoice. It exhaled. But Rome would never be the same again.